Hey, welcome back, everyone, to the Data Ideas podcast here for episode 65. I can't believe I've done 65 episodes, but I'm glad to be doing episode 65 with Lindsay Hummel. Lindsay, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, great to have you. And, we were just talking before we went live. The first question I always like to ask folks is, how did they get started in data and analytics? And I think you have a really interesting journey to share. So I'm especially excited to ask you that first question. How did you get interested in data and analytics?
That's a really good question. It has not been a linear path for me by far, but it's funny. I was reflecting kind of on this in hindsight. And the first time I ever worked with data, actually, I was 12 years old. And I was a volunteer at our local hospital. And I was a young middle schooler that was working in the basement doing data entry at our hospital when I was 12 years old.
Okay.
That was really, if I think back, that was really the first start. In undergrad, I wanted to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology. And so I was a psychology student doing a lot in psychometrics, working in academic research, doing my own research. And so I was really immersed in data kind of from this academic perspective of wanting to work in that field, and got really burnt out. So then I pivoted to working in nonprofits, which there's no burnout there, of course. And I served in AmeriCorps, which is essentially like the domestic Peace Corps in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I was running a K-8 education program and doing a lot of data work for program evaluations. So creating assessments for our program. I was the only staff member there. So we were running tutoring programs in rural Appalachia. I was writing grant reports, doing a lot of data collection for that piece of it. And then after my year of service was up, I pivoted to working in tech startups, which is also, very easy as well. No burnout there.
Right.
And was working with data in a very different capacity. So it was a small tech startup where they were manufacturing IoT devices, and we could not afford to build an ERP. So this will date me a little bit, but we were trying to make our own ERP system out of Excel and FileMaker Pro. If you have ever used that many moons ago. And so I was working with executive dashboards and then consulting for other startups at the time, doing, program evaluations for their historical data, looking at survey methodology and all those sorts of like program assessments. But it wasn't until many years after that, when I had been doing a lot of contract work and kind of fell back into higher ed, that I actually got my first data analyst role in 2019. So I had worked with it kind of for 7-8 years all along the path in different non-data roles, but it wasn't until many years later that I actually made the pivot to my first actual data analyst role.
Cool. That's really interesting. And I would say from, the guests I've spoken with on this, show, as well as in conferences and things like that, it feels like roughly like half of folks have kind of this only data background. And then I would say like an entire half of the industry has, a background where they start in something that was not technical and kind of find their way into data. And I think that's really cool because I think like there's really, really strong practitioners that have made a huge impact that did not start in a technical role. And I think people don't realize that. Do people ask you like, do I have to have a technical background to get in, or like,
Yeah, absolutely. I come from someone who, or come from a background where I did not have a computer science background. I didn't have a technical background. I was actually hired for my first data role before I even knew how to write code. So it was very much kind of thrown into an environment of, this is a new world. I've been adjacent to it. I know enough to be dangerous. But I think having a really rich, immersive background, working with it in a hands-on capacity, and also working in a lot of industries where you get hands-on business experience, hands-on program experience, operational experience, have all been incredible assets for me as an analyst, because I've done a lot of that sort of work in the roles that I've had, even in tech. So as a data analyst, a lot of the things that I've done have not necessarily been traditional analytics, and having kind of that really immersive, diverse experience has only been helpful for me.
Awesome. Very cool. And I just wanted to pause for a second to encourage folks, if you are joining the live stream, so the podcast will be available on Friday, July 11th, which is tomorrow as of right now. But and so hello to everyone listening to the recording. But if you are joining live, definitely let us know in the comments. Just say hello. Let us know where you're coming from. It's always good to see who's who's joining the live stream. And if you do have a question, drop it in the chat. Maybe we'll have time at the end for a question or two. But always good to see who's joining the live stream. We were talking a little bit before we went live too about the fact that you had a unique experience in that you gave a TEDx talk, and then I think you actually hosted a TEDx event, and this was before you got into tech. Is that right?
Yep. So I did that when I was in undergrad. I spoke at a TEDx event in Nashville, Tennessee, and then I hosted the first TEDx at my institution at the University of Tennessee. So one thing about me is I've always been a little bit scrappy, a little bit resourceful, a little bit entrepreneurial, and those are skills that also serve you really, really well in the tech industry. So much of what I have done has certainly made its way full circle. But yeah, it's hard to be the first one to do some of those things, and especially when I hosted my event, it was just one of those things where I had an idea and said, hey, I think this would be really great. And I was at a really large institution, and they said, we're not going to be a part of this. If you want to do this, you can pay for it yourself. So I did, and I hosted it, and it was a really challenging experience at the time, but it's been running for 10 years ever since then. Wow. So I consider that a win.
Cool. And like, if someone wants to give, I know there's different kinds of TED Talks.
Yeah.
Like if someone wants to give a TED Talk or TEDx talk, like how does someone do that?
That's a great question. I had been plugged in with some other folks who were engaged in kind of the TEDx community in my local town, and they got me plugged in, and I was a kind of friend of a friend of a friend who got a referral, and somebody reached out to me that was hosting an event in Nashville, and they said, hey, do you want to speak? Do you want to be a part of this? And I said, yes, absolutely. And so I did that. I think if there are opportunities in your local community, you can go on the TED website, you can see people who are hosting, just reach out to them, just talk to them and say, hey, I would love to be a part. I would love to volunteer. I would love to attend. If you have the chance to be engaged, I think that's always a good first step.
That's awesome. That's really cool. And just wanted to say hello to a few people that are giving shout outs here. So Kyle, sounds like Kyle knows you, Lindsay.
Hi, Kyle.
Hello to Jante, coming to us from Dallas.
Hi.
Hey to Evelyn. Good to see you from Orlando. If you are joining the live, please do say hello. Let us know where you're coming from. It's always good to see who's joining the live stream. And thanks for joining us tonight, or this morning, or whatever time it is in your local area. A couple of folks it looks like I think everyone's from the US here, so probably this evening. But very cool. Yeah, when I saw that you had given a TEDx talk, I was interested in that myself. I've never given one myself, and I thought, I wonder if it's even possible, to do it. Like, how hard is it to do? It
is possible. I mean, if there's anything I've learned throughout my career, it's that and even working in data, working not in data and startups, whatever it is, whatever project you want to do, the first step is just taking the initiative to say, hey, I want to do this. And then you just start to do it.
Totally.
It's not that simple, but you know what I mean? Taking the initiative, getting started with the project, and then putting yourself out there, and then you can make it happen.
Very cool. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about making pivots and being a career chameleon, which I know is a branded term that you have. We'll get into that a little bit, but you're about to make a pivot yourself.
Yeah.
You've had some really strong, data focused experience, and you're going to pivot to a little bit different role, which I think is interesting and is worthy of highlighting to the community, because you're going from a data role to a role in tech, but it's more of a client-facing role. It's not like you're going to be doing data analysis. And I'd love to hear more about that, because I think sometimes folks think they're in data and they have to stay in data and there's nothing else open to them, but that's just not the case. And so could you talk a little bit about this pivot that you're making?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would preface this first that I've been a data analyst, but I've been kind of cosplaying as a data analyst because I don't do a lot of traditional analytics, right? So I think it's important for people to understand that it is such a vast industry, and the term data analyst means so many different things, and you can be doing lots of different types of work even within that role. So in my experience as a data analyst, even over the past 6 years across multiple industries, I have worked as, leading a data governance committee. So I've worked on a lot of those sorts of projects. I've been heavily involved in organizational assessments and pitching ideas to senior leadership, and, working on a lot of data literacy initiatives and things that are more operational, maybe in nature than traditional analytics. I've done a lot of data migrations and, infrastructure pieces. And now even in my current role, I work a lot in product development. So I kind of function more on the product owner, software developer, dev, kind of squishy middle ground, systems analyst. And so there's so much opportunity there. And so for me, it's been a natural transition now to be pivoting back to operations into a non-technical role where I will be leading software implementations for a tech company. So cool. I'll be building out the operations team, kind of working to scale that infrastructure, and then also helping bridge the gap between the technical teams, the business teams, the clients, and moving those implementations forward. But I have done a lot of that sort of work, even as a data analyst already. So it seems like it's a big pivot, but in my experience as an analyst, this stuff is also still in my wheelhouse. And it's very much in keeping with kind of this ragtag, eclectic career path that I've built for myself. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You make some really good points there that I think folks should take note of. And we were talking about this in the pre-meeting that we had. I had kind of a similar experience myself in that I was a data practitioner in kind of progressive roles for several years. And then I went and worked for, kind of a tech company in startup mode. And, folks were asking me like, okay, so is it super different going from like, being a director of analytics or manager of analytics to, like working in customer facing positions. And the thing is for me, it really, there was a lot of transferable skills and activities there because especially as I got into more of the programmatic leadership type roles, I was selling all the time, right? Like I had to train people on the data products, so pretty similar to training people on software tools. And I had to sell the value of those data products. Same thing as selling the value of a software tool, so, and internal conversations with internal clients, or stakeholders are very similar in nature to conversations with external customers. And so I don't know if folks always connect those dots, but I think that they are there. And I think it's cool that you highlighted that.
Yeah. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. Everything for me has been about the transferable skills. There are so many different opportunities where the roles seem very different. But if you look at the Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap in the middle. Right. And so the key, especially in pivoting between different industries, because I have done a lot. I've contracted where I've worked from everybody from small businesses to Fortune 100 companies, to government, to corporate, to finance, to academia, to startups, you name it. And really the key is finding those commonalities and finding those transferable skills and then being able to leverage them across roles because they're not really at the core competency level. Problem solving is the same, communication, it might be a little bit different, but at the end of the day, it's the same. There's so many transferable skills that you can leverage, and that makes it a lot easier to be able to explore these kind of pivots.
Totally agree. Very cool. And what would you say? So you worked on kind of technical projects, in the data space, but you also, to your point, worked on, programmatic type work. Yeah. You mentioned data literacy, data governance. And so there's kind of a difference between hands-on technical work, and actually doing the analysis, coding, things like that, and then being a programmatic lead. Like between all of those experiences, like what do you think was the experience or experiences that prepared you best for this kind of a pivot that you're making?
That's a really good question. What's funny is that I don't think it was the data experience. I think it was all of the things that I did within being a data analyst that really helped prepare me for this. A lot of the infrastructure pieces, obviously it's funny, my first project that I worked on, if I can kind of back up and tell the story about how I first landed my first job as a data analyst. I had worked in higher ed. I was working in fundraising, specifically in a development office and working more on the programmatic administrative side. Okay. I was working with our planned giving program or like bequests and wills and estates and things like that.
Yep.
And so I was walking in and realized we have a lot of historical data that's just like, it's not up to date. They were all in the physical files out in the hall in the filing cabinets. And I was one of those people who, being very operationally minded, I was like, no, I can't, we got to clean this up. Right. I love an audit. And so I went to the team and just said like, hey, I want to do a historical audit of this entire program and get all of our data cleaned up. Like, is everybody cool with that? Like, any issues with that? And everyone said, no, that's fine. Go ahead. And I had been interested in data. And so I had already connected with kind of our data services team and expressed an interest and told them, hey, I want to do this cleanup. And so I started doing a cleanup, and it was even a manual review of going through the data, piling it all into a big spreadsheet, figuring out what's missing, what do we have, where are the discrepancies. And it was all very manual at the time. And it was probably 3 months later that the executive director of the data team came to me and said, what would you think if we made a data analyst role for you? Would you be interested in that? And I said, well, I don't even know how to code. I don't know how to do this work. They had seen that I was interested, and they had set me up a sandbox environment in our Oracle region, which was very cool. And so there was already like a little bit of work that I had done with them just on some of my own personal work that I was doing for my department. But I said, I don't know if I'm really qualified for this. And she said, well, no, I mean, like, you're clearly already doing the work. You have an inclination. We feel like we can train you and bring you up to speed.
Okay.
This work. And it was that simple. And then they promoted me up to a data analyst role, and I learned how to code on the fly 3 months right before the pandemic, fun fact. So that was quite the transition of learning how to do that all at home via email. But I think really that project of taking the initiative of just saying, hey, I want to do this, that transitioned me into the role, was really helpful. But before I had even done that, the first project I worked on with that team was they recruited me to be the development subject matter expert for a software implementation that we did in our group. And so now, of course, many years later, I'm going to be doing that full time. So, you know, things are really full circle in many ways. And the small projects that you get a chance to participate in can sometimes lay the foundation for you to do those same sorts of projects later on.
Yeah, that's really true. There's actually, you know, I think even back to like when I was an intern, there was, not to get into the specifics of it, but like there was a like random project I was assigned to where I felt it was like pretty mundane, but like it was data related. And the concept around that project was kind of a concept that I, you know, implemented in another place at a much larger scale. And I would have never expected that little project I was a part of as an intern would be something that I could expand on the vision at, you know, in a greater capacity, in a different role at a different organization. And so I completely agree with you in that you never know on some of those smaller projects. Sometimes those are the catalysts for other things that you can do to make a bigger impact and bigger opportunities that open up.
Yeah, it's all full circle. And ironically, my data analyst role was in a basement. So I started out doing data entry in a basement, and then almost 20 years later, back doing the same thing. So never discount the small moments, because you all learn something from it. You take something from it, whatever it is. There's always something that you can build on from there.
Absolutely. And I like Al's comment, and hello to Albert Bellamy. He said, funny how that works. She told her work, I want to do this, and it happened. I like that, because I think that's often overlooked, right? Like saying what you want to do and making sure people know that, like, it goes a long way. And I've had people come to me, like when I've been in prior leadership roles, where I said like, hey, this is something I'm interested in, or, hey, you know, I'm interested in doing this thing next. How can I get there? You know, and it's like, I just wouldn't have day-to-day been thinking about the fact that they wanted to do that had they not told me. And so can you talk a little bit about maybe just like the importance, or just offer any encouragement to folks that maybe they should speak up if they have an interest in doing something specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I'm a big fan of just not necessarily asking for permission in some respects, but taking the initiative to work on projects. Almost all of the data projects that I've worked on have been projects that I just did because I wanted to do them, you know, especially when it's low hanging fruit. You don't need a lot of resources. I'll give you an example. I worked on a project once with a local election board, and we were testing voting machines. And this was a project that I actually loved. I had so much fun doing this. It was very different than the work that I'd done before, but your girl loves an operational process, right? So I was very, very excited. And so we're going through the testing process ahead of the public vote, and like getting the behind the scenes of this was very cool. They bring in a company, and they've got all of these different voting machines that we're testing to make sure that they are sound for the public vote. And as I was going through the testing process over the weeks with a big team of people, I realized, I think there's a better way we could do this. I think that we could reduce our testing time if we changed the configuration of the machine layout during the testing process. And so I didn't talk to anybody, but I just did my own time study. And I did the regular testing way and collected my own data just on a piece of paper as I was going through the process. And then I moved one of the machines like 90 degrees and did a testing process and a time study for that too. And found that I reduced our testing time by about 30% doing it that way. Okay. And so then on one of our breaks, I just went to the leadership for the company that was sponsoring this. And I just said, hey, I did a time study. And I found that if we made this improvement, that we could reduce our time by 30%. And then you could reduce the number of people you have to hire. You could reduce your total testing time to turn this around. So it's one of those things where I think being able to work on these kinds of projects is more accessible than people realize. If you have an idea, you can run it like an experiment. You can observe something in your environment, you can do it, and then you can leverage that information with leadership to say, hey, this is something I discovered. Can we look into this, or can I work on this? A lot of times people are very happy to get stuff off of their plate. So if you just volunteer and say, hey, I kind of want to explore this, can I do that? As long as your work is getting done, as long as you're able to still manage your priorities, generally people don't really care. So I'd say if you have an idea, take the initiative and run with it.
That's great advice. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the fact that you've had roles across different industries and you've worked with a bunch of different types of stakeholders, I would assume, during that time.
Yes, I have.
Yes. In terms of that wide range of folks you've worked with across industries, like what are some of the most valuable lessons you've taken away from that experience? Like what have you learned that you can really apply for the future from working with so many different types of folks on technical projects or data projects?
Yeah, so I would say that this is good advice for anybody, especially in data, but just good advice in general. You're going to work with stakeholders who may be very technical and other stakeholders who might recognize a computer on site, and everybody in between. And so your role is really about being able to communicate with folks on all aspects of the spectrum and everybody in between. And so being able to me, I think, being able to communicate with those folks kind of boils down to two things: of finding a common language and then finding common ground. So I'm a big fan of the explain it to me like I'm 5 model. And it's not to be patronizing, but it's to say, let's level set, to use an MBA term. We need to level set, make sure we're using the same terminology, the same definitions for what these things mean. Sometimes easy miscommunications can come up because we're using this word this way, you're using it to interpret it this way. Sure. And that's a really easy thing to alleviate by just saying, let's make sure we're all on the same page, looking at the same information, having the same conversation. And then also finding common ground of where you can align with those folks, because it's important to recognize that every stakeholder has their own needs, their own priorities, their own agenda, and those things might not align with your needs, your priorities, and your agenda. And so it's important to find ways that you can establish common ground to remember that you're on the same team and figure out how you can work together. And especially if you're on the technical side of things and you are trying to communicate with folks who are more on the business side of things, being able to translate the work that you're doing into here's the business impact is really key. Because if you're just saying like, hey, we're doing this super technical thing and here's the very technical impact, it's not going to be viable. It's not going to land. It doesn't mean anything. So you really have to be able to translate that. So I can give an example actually of a data assessment that I did in an organization where I went to our VP because I sensed that there was a disconnect across the organization of like, we're using data, and I was a data analyst at the time. We're using data, but I'm getting the vibe that nobody knows what the heck we're doing with it, right? So I did an assessment and I asked people to indicate if they understood how we used data to make decisions within our organization. And I specifically included executive directors, and 100% of the responses came back that people had no idea. And so I took that information then to our vice president and was able to sit down with him and say, 100% of these people, like of the people surveyed, do not understand how we're using data to set our KPIs, and that includes the people on your executive cabinet who are a part of those KPI decision conversations, right? You can see those disconnects. So when you sell it that way, and you can translate it to say, hey, here's a data thing or here's a technical thing, but here's the impact of how that's showing up in our work, that really helps bridge the gap.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that is like crazy powerful data point that you were able to share back. I'm guessing that got that garnered some attention.
It did. And especially, one of the things, again, coming to it from an ops perspective, I'd be curious to know how many data folks ask their stakeholders, like, do you know, like, how do you feel when you work with data? What do you do when you work with it? What do you do when you don't know what to do with it? And I asked those questions, and everybody came back and said, well, I asked the executive director. And so when I sat down with him, with our vice president, to have this conversation, because I was ultimately trying to kind of change the data culture. I was trying to get more investments for the data team. And I framed it to him as, hey, you have everybody who is reaching out to your executive director and using her as a resource, which means she is not able to do her work for you as your cabinet member working on strategic operational initiatives.
Sure.
And so we need to alleviate kind of this backlog in the workflow so that we can free up her capacity to better support you and our organizational needs and our operational needs. And also we need to make sure she doesn't burn out, because we can see that she's doing a lot of this work because we have not operationalized or standardized how we're using data throughout the organization. And so when you think about data strategically, it's really approaching it more from a consultant perspective than an analyst perspective.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective. And it's interesting because oftentimes when you talk with folks around your organization, or perhaps stakeholders that you've rolled a data product out to, or their managers or leadership team, oftentimes I think there's a perception that doesn't necessarily, sometimes it matches reality, but it doesn't always necessarily match reality. And you can only see that by asking questions, by surveying, or perhaps looking at utilization data. And it's always interesting to see what people really think, what they're really using, what they're really not using, and how that matches with the talking points. And only through doing that can you really get the full return out of your data products. Because if you just trust, what you want to believe or what people are just kind of saying, or, around the hallways or whatever, like that may not move the needle from an ROI perspective. You've got to get the data, you've got to find out what's really going on, and then take action on it. That sounds like exactly like what you were doing.
Yeah, I certainly tried. And it's because I've had so much experience working with stakeholders and working in so many different shops, seeing so many operational behind the scenes. So it was one of those things where I was able to really leverage a lot of that experience to have kind of that water cooler talk with folks, to be able to pull them aside and say, hey, I'm getting this sense. What's your experience like? And using that to really launch forward at a more organizational, level.
Cool. Yeah, being intentional about finding out kind of the reality of how data is being used, how comfortable folks are with it, what that real utilization looks like is so critical to getting a full return out of your data and data products. Lee had a question. I don't know if you can share a general ballpark figure of how many folks were in that survey that you conducted.
Yeah, so it was about 30% of our organization.
Wow. Okay.
So we had a pretty small group within our department, so about 50 people total. So of that group, I tried to get a pretty good sample, because the goal was to use this as an opportunity to lay the groundwork and establish buy-in with leadership for why we needed to take this project seriously. I had just started my MBA and done a 360 assessment, and so I had gotten feedback that I needed to be more visible from some folks in the department that participated in that. And so I use this as a good case study of, hey, I'm doing this as kind of part of a project for my program. Can I do this sample, and can we see if this has legs before we roll it out to everybody? And people were very supportive and receptive to doing that. And so it was a pretty small sample, but it was very representative of the larger group. And it included people who were newer, who had been there for 15 years within the organization, all sorts of different technical levels. So it was a pretty representative sample to give us a good idea of what the population looked like. And again, I also included people on the data team, and the fact that they also indicated, I'm not comfortable working with data. I don't know how we use data. To me, was a huge red flag to be able to take back to say, even the people on the data team have questions about this.
Wow. So. That's amazing. Cool. And Lee says, yes, that's a lot of communication. Cool. No, I like that story. That's a great perspective. And I think there's a lot of good learnings around those exercises. So that's really cool. What do you think in terms of, so, a lot of folks kind of switching gears a little bit here. It goes back to kind of the story you told earlier about kind of getting that data role carved out for you after you kind of showed what you could do, and how you could apply your skills. Lots of folks ask, like, how am I supposed to get a data role, where most positions say you need 1 or 2 years of experience, right? But like, if those are entry level roles, like that doesn't feel like entry level, and so like, what would your advice be on, how do they get that experience like you did, where, a company actually, saw the potential and turned it into a role? Like, should folks just like try to do projects within the scope of their current role, or like what kind of tactics can they deploy, I guess, to kind of get some of that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a huge proponent of find data work regardless of where you are. And that can look like lots of different things. So I had finally landed my first data role in 2019, but I had already been working on data projects at that point for 7, 8+ years. So I had had kind of a long trajectory of finding opportunities to work on data projects. And they were projects that I either volunteered to take on in my role, like my time study. That was a good example of, I'm just collecting data and I'm turning it into an actual business impact just on a Tuesday afternoon because I have an idea to do that. So it can be as simple as, wherever you are, just observe what's around you, find a business problem. If you have an idea, start working on it, right? There are also opportunities where you can work cross-functionally, where you can reach out to the data team to say, hey, do you all need help with a project? Or is there an opportunity to be on a committee? Some of the larger corporations are a little bit more structured like that. And there is a lot of push for cross-functional collaboration. So find ways you can do that. Find ways that you can ask for informational interviews from people to say, this is how I'm looking to get started. But I'm a big believer in just doing the work from wherever you are. So one project that I did, for example, when I was a receptionist, okay, so it was my job to answer the phone, to, get coffee for people in the office. And in that role, I worked on a project where I analyzed the giving trends for one of our giving programs for the chancellor of the university. And I did a historical analysis. I put together a big presentation for one of our directors to give to them. And I was doing it at the front desk, in between greeting people, picking up the FedEx packages, right? If you have the skills, if you have the interest, those projects are kind of all around you. So it's just a matter of, again, taking that initiative, getting involved. There are local nonprofits in your community, most likely, and they really need help with these sorts of things. Reach out to them because they don't have capacity to hire folks. There are tons of organizations that are all about uniting data folks and social good, and helping cultivate some of those projects, get involved with those communities. I know you can certainly speak to the Tableau community. There are so many ways that you can get involved. So sometimes it's just a matter of taking the agency to say, hey, I want to work on these projects. Where can I find them? And then going out and doing them. I will be the first one to say, you don't need to learn another tool. You don't need another certificate. You don't need to work with one of these like curated Titanic data sets, right? Like, don't do that. Find something real that you can put your teeth into. Even if it's just a matter of, you go to the grocery store and you observe, hey, what is the rate of people going through self-checkout versus with a cashier? Do I see differences here? What would the business impact for that be? And create your own little case study, essentially. And that will get you into the mindset of being able to think like an analyst. And you can use that sort of framework to then be able to leverage your way into a data role, hopefully. down the road.
Cool. And what I like about that is that it gives you the opportunity to be able to tell a story about something
Exactly.
that you did, right? And not only tell the story about technically how you made this, project come to life, but also connect the dots between how you think it would add value or connect to business
Yeah.
value or, make an organization more efficient, et cetera. I know that, you're a big believer in telling a good story, positioning your experience. Like, what recommendations do you have for folks on how important is it to be able to market your experiences and tell a good story that gets folks' attention, whether it's networking or interviewing for a position? Like, what's the criticality of being able to do that?
Yeah, I think it's becoming even more important. And this is not something that I am a pro in. I actually have a rhetoric degree, which is rhetoric is the art of persuasive communication. So I should be better at this, I feel like, than I am sometimes. But especially now, we're all inundated with noise. And I think it becomes more important than ever to be able to come to the table to say, hey, here's my value proposition, right? Here's who I am. Here's why you should be interested. Here's what I can do for you. One mistake that I see a lot of folks make is that they network, but they're doing it in a more transactional capacity of saying,
Totally.
hey, I want to reach out to you. I get cold DMs all the time. I get cold chats with people who say like, hey, give me a job, tell me what to do. And it's like, no, that's not how this works, right?
Right.
You have to build reciprocal relationships. And that is all about, hey, here's my cell, here's why you should want to engage with me. Here's what I bring to the table. Here's what I can do. I did that a lot, obviously, in the nonprofit space and in the higher ed fundraising space. We were saying, hey, here's why you should invest. Here's what we're about. It needs to be clear so that way people can just know, hey, okay, I get you. I get what's in it for me by engaging with you. And being able to build that relationship of, hey, here's what I bring to the table. And so I think in interviews, especially, one thing I found with pivoting is that it can be challenging sometimes if an employer is looking at bringing you in, they're making an investment in you, and you have to be able to back that up to say, here's why I'm worth investing in. Right. And for me, especially, I've been a career chameleon. I love the way you said that. I'm going to start charging.
Well, that was I stole it from you. That was your trademark term.
Gonna charge a royalty. You heard it here first. That's right. my first book. That's actually a good idea.
That'd be a good name for a book.
We heard it here on July 10th.
When it comes out, we got to add it back to the show notes for this episode.
All right, I'm gonna write as soon as we wrap up here. So when you're explaining, hey, I've done these pivots, here's what I bring to the table. It's almost like you have to reject their rejection or their objections before they even bring them to the table, and to have a very clear sell of, this is my elevator pitch. This is who I'm about. This is what I can do. And also, this is where I want to go. This is what I want to work on. It kind of goes back to pitching those project ideas of like, hey, I want to do this, and here's why. That sell, I think, becomes more important, especially the more inundated we are with data, right? Because we're all trying to sort through the noise more efficiently. And so it's really important to be able to cut through that clearly and say, you don't have to waste energy figuring out who I am, because I'm going to tell you right now.
Very cool. I like that. And in terms of being a career chameleon as it applies to moving across industries, I'd like to talk a little bit about this, because you have experience doing this. And, I don't have as much experience as you do. The only time I would say that I've kind of done that of going across industries was that jump to startup, and then kind of came back into a programmatic role in a healthcare organization where I'd been mostly in business for most of my career. And so, I feel like I've been okay with this, but I'd like to learn a little bit more from you. Like, how, what does that look like? Like what are the tactics? Like, what do people have to be thinking about if they want to go from one industry to another? Because I feel like a lot of times it's the same thing as like folks feeling like they are stuck in being in data and they can't go into a slightly different technical role. Like, I think folks feel like, okay, if I've always been in the financial services industry, I always have to stay here, but that clearly isn't the case. People do switch industries just like you did. What does that look like? What are some things you have to think about if you're doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I will die on this hill that I think everybody should do contract work at one point in their life, because it teaches you how to show up and immediately provide value from day one, no matter where you're going, who you're working with, what you're working on. I did that for a few years, and I had a chance to work in so many different industries, so many different environments, often without any training or resources. And you just are expected. Sometimes your contract is 1 day, sometimes it's 1 year. You know, you have no idea, and you're just walking in the door, and they expect, hey, I'm paying for you, so you need to do this specific deliverable for me. And so you become really, really good, in my experience, when you start doing things like that, at being able to see, here are the commonalities across industries. And it's not just a matter of here's how the work is similar, but you also have to think about, how is the industry similar? When you're working in a startup, okay, it's no guardrails, it's very fast paced, it's very loosey-goosey, it's very scrappy, resourceful, we're learning on the go, right? So if you're somebody who likes structure, it's probably not the best fit for you. But you can easily take that model and then say, I've worked in this ecosystem before. I've interfaced with this level of people before. I've worked with stakeholders. I've worked with C-suite. I've worked on, one thing I like to think about a lot is I have worked on highly visible projects. And it doesn't matter if it's in higher ed or if it's in fintech. It's high pressure, high stakes, highly visible. So I know what that experience is like because I've already done it. So it doesn't matter to me that the software spits out green instead of 2, you know, like that's immaterial. The experience is the same. And that's what I always come back to in my cells of, here's how I have worked in this type of ecosystem previously on similar work, and here's how it translates. So I've worked in really bureaucratic, institutionalized environments. That means I know how to work within the kind of the rules of the game, if you will. I know how to work in really highly structured environments where there might be more asking for permission than forgiveness, you know? And so when you start to learn the culture of work, it becomes a little bit easier to make that kind of cross jump to say, I've already done this level and this is kind of the same, and here's how. So therefore I will be successful here because I've already done it over in this space. And for me, my value prop has been, I have learned how to learn. So I can walk in the door and immediately provide value. I've already done it. I've been doing it literally my whole career. I've made a career out of pivoting careers, right? And so that becomes part of the sell of, like, it doesn't matter what you put in front of me. I have the track record in these ways to be able to deliver to that. So I was in an interview actually for my current role, or my new role that I'm moving to, where my current boss, my new boss, was saying, you know, I'm the only one who's kind of done this type of work. And so, you know, we were talking through that experience, and I was able to say, I have made a career out of transferring institutional knowledge. So I'm already equipped to be able to handle the business challenge that you are putting in front of me. Here's how I would tackle it. Here's how we can do that. Here's how we can make that a smooth process. So it's about thinking not just about the task itself or the industry itself, but again, looking for that overlap in the Venn diagram to say, how have I done, again, the core competency of this work in this environment in a similar way? And how does that translate? Product development in fintech versus product development in a startup, you're making widgets, right? So like I get that workflow. If the workflow can have more steps over here than it does over here, but I get the workflow, you know? So finding those commonalities, finding those similarities, and being able to connect the dots for the interviewer especially is, I think, something that's, for me, been key.
Very cool. That's awesome. And I think, you know, there's a comment in the chat about, so it's, you know, kind of debating, would you consider it a pivot or not? And I think, like, you could look at this in one of two ways. I think that statement is interesting, right? Like, and I was kind of thinking as you were talking, it's like, you know, it kind of is in the eye of the individual, you know, in terms of how they want to, or it's kind of in the mind of the individual in terms of how they want to position their experience, right? Like, you develop this muscle memory around adding value with the skills that you have and the technical skills that you have, and you're able to articulate that in a translatable way to someone in a different industry, right? And so whether that's a pivot or not, I mean, I think, you know, in a strict sense, yeah, it is a pivot. But, like, you know, you're making a strong case, I think, to folks, which is the right one, is that don't be so afraid of that, or don't be intimidated by that perception that it's a pivot, right? Am I characterizing that the right way?
No, I think you are, because
Yeah.
on one hand, yes, going from data analyst, writing code, doing more technical work, to building operations, working with end users, with external clients, doing this sort of operational coordination is very different work. But at the same time, it's really not, right? Because at the end of the day, the work itself is different, but you're still communicating with stakeholders. You're still documenting the work that you're doing. You're still scaling operations, which is something I've done in all of my work throughout my career. A lot of the things that you're doing, when you kind of boil it down to its very core level, is kind of the same. And so, yes, it's a pivot, but also not really. It's in the same wheelhouse, I think, but also you can make the wheelhouse be all encompassing. So I'm not going to go be a neurosurgeon by any means. That certainly would be a pivot, but even still, I would be able to boil that down to say, yeah, but like, I'm still working with patients. I'm still communicating with families. I'm still organizing and coordinating, and I'm still being very strategic and analytical. So, you are the same across the roles. And I think that's the part that you have to make the connection with, is like, I am the constant and here's what I bring to the table.
Absolutely.
And so how does that impact regardless of whatever the environment is? Like, I'm going to be the same anywhere. I'm always going to want to do an audit. I'm going to want to document. I'm going to want to do these things that I've done. It doesn't matter where I am, that's who I am. And so I think that piece is also important to think about too, is that yes, it's a change, but also it doesn't have to be maybe as much of a change as it feels.
And I think this is great advice. And, there's been, we talked about this too before going on the air. Folks have asked me for advice on their careers, and they've said, I'm thinking about this type of role, but I don't have any experience in that. And then I dig in a little bit and learn a little bit more about their background. And the way that I'm hearing them articulate, I'm like, okay, I could point out, experience that's transferable from that, position or that volunteer activity, right? And then by the end of the time of them explaining to me, it's like, wow, I think you have a lot that actually translates, into that type of role that you're going for. And like, sometimes they don't even see it, and so I think this should be encouraging to folks, to just take maybe a second look and a hard look at your experience and think about what you did in those roles or volunteer, capacities or things like that, and think about how that might apply or be transferable to a different position, if that's what you're going for, internally or externally or whatever. You'd be surprised at, how much you've done and how you can position that experience maybe in a slightly different way.
1,000%. My first data analyst in my first data analyst job, my boss used to always call our work electronic ditch digging. Right? Because we're moving data here, taking it here, throwing it over here, right? So moving dirt across these places. And I think, again, going back to the explain it to me like I'm 5, like when you boil it down to its essential thing, like, isn't that all data engineering is really, right? It's like taking thing here, putting it here, moving it over here. Like, I think sometimes we get really trapped and bogged down in all of the technical minutia. And it's like, forget about that for a second. Nobody cares, right? Like, we can get to that later. But when you look at its core work, the function is the same. So where are the similar functions where the output is the same, and you can walk through the same process? Because I even had that conversation for this role of, hey, they asked me, what are your technical, like what's your technical expertise level? And I'll be the first one to always say, like, I know enough to be dangerous, right? I'm not going to be the smartest resource in the room when it comes to technical expertise, but even though I haven't worked with implementing APIs, I can learn, right? Because it's like, okay, take information, take it here, put it here. So once you learn the core of how a system works and you think about it in a system workflow way, the pipeline gets so much easier to manage, and again, the levers might be a little different, the steps might be different, but at its core, again, I would just encourage folks to look at where the commonalities are the same. And just drill down until you kind of get to, at its baseline, what is this job? What is this task? What is this work?
That's great advice. And it's, it's not, I think too, like, folks might worry that it's like selfish to think in those ways or whatever. Like, I don't think it is at all. Like, I think it's, this is just another bit of encouragement I want to give to folks, because let's be honest, sometimes we can be a little bit more reserved in this field and things like that. But like, it's to leverage your strengths that you have kind of in a new way or a little bit more creatively, like that benefits your organization that you're working for too. It's organizations don't always benefit fully if folks don't step outside of their shell a little bit and try something a little bit different and push their skills in a little bit different capacity. So anyways, I think it's mutually beneficial to think in this way. So love the advice. And as we wind down, a couple more questions, but just want to encourage folks, if you are joining live, if you do have a question, we'll be live for probably a few more minutes. Maybe we'll have time for a question or two, but go ahead and drop it in the chat. It's been good to see everybody's comments. And also, I just wanted to say hello to, I always want to shout out when someone's from my home state is joining. Hello to Omar from Franklin, Wisconsin. Omar, I don't know if we know each other, but feel free to drop me a note on LinkedIn. Franklin is in the greater Milwaukee area. So anyways, good to see someone from the hometown here.
We love the Midwest. I'm also in the Midwest, born and raised. So
that's right. We didn't even talk about that. You're in Indy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. I kind of lived in the South for a while, but again, pivots, they come back.
There you go.
All full circle.
Very cool. Yes. Awesome to have someone from the Midwest on as well. So you mentioned coffee chats. You've been having some of those, or maybe we talked about that before going on. But you've got some coffee chats that you've been doing, and you've been having fun with that kind of networking. How can folks follow you? I know you've got a lot of content coming out, or if they want to do a coffee chat, how can they reach you? How can folks follow more of your content?
Yeah, absolutely. So connect with me on LinkedIn. I am more new to sharing on LinkedIn because I was always very intimidated by the platform. I give my MBA so much credit for helping me really build the confidence to see my skills, because I had so much imposter syndrome for the longest time of being told, especially as a woman working in male-dominated tech spaces and male-dominated spaces of no, you just need to be over here and be quiet. And so I was really intimidated to be a person on the internet, as I like to think of it, because I felt like there wasn't space for me. And I have recently kind of shifted to a point just personally in my own growth of saying, hey, there's an opportunity to build something here. I feel like I have enough credo behind my name now with some of the things that I've done and the experience that I've done. And I do have an MBA now. So I'm technically a master in business for what it's worth, right? So I know a thing or two, and I can be the person that I needed to be years ago, maybe when I was kind of struggling throughout my career path with some of the challenges that I was hitting. And so I've started sharing more content. People are more than welcome to follow, to reach out, send me DMs. I'm happy to help if I can, because I am a big believer in not pulling the ladder up behind me, because I've had so many folks who've kind of done that to me through my own journey. And so I really want to democratize this information, no gatekeeping. If I can help, I want to help. I can't, do everything for everybody. I can't find you a job, right? But if there's something that I can do, folks are welcome to reach out.
Very cool. Awesome. And we'll be sure to put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. And then also when the Career Chameleon book comes out, we'll be sure to put a link to that. Yeah.
I'm telling you, you know what? You have actually inspired that I should do this. This is a great idea. So I'll make sure I put a note in the forward. Thank you for the insight.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Okay. So now
the book has been on my bucket list, but this might be the catalyst to be like, no, I actually need to make this be a thing. I have some solid advice now.
That's awesome. I think it's a great topic. And folks, if you think so too, shoot
Lindsay
a message, offer some encouragement. It's hard work to write a book. So
yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I definitely appreciate you joining for the episode. This has been really insightful.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for having me. I am so thrilled to be here. Thank you for chatting with me. Thank you so much to all the folks who have joined, who've put in questions. Please feel free to reach out. I promise I don't bite. I try to be really friendly. So
yeah, for sure. Awesome. Thanks again. And like I said, we'll put the link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. If you are listening to this show via any of the podcast platforms, after you're done listening, you can take a look at the show notes, but definitely go and follow Lindsay. She's been putting out some really great content, and I trust much more content is coming from you, perhaps even the book down the road. So great speaking with you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I think we need more behind the scenes, real looks at what this work is actually like.
Absolutely. Yep. And a closing comment here from Muhammad. Muhammad says, you're awesome. And he has a coffee chat tomorrow, it sounds like, with you.
Tomorrow. Wow. Tomorrow
Okay.
we're talking about breaking into tech. So yeah,
Cool.
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks again, Lindsay.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
we'll
so
see
much.
everyone back next week. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.